Welcome to Product Academy Tough Stuff, the podcast where we cut through the noise and get straight to the toughest challenges in product management. I'm Tanya Lau.
And I'm Francesca Cortesi.
In each episode, we tackle one tough question. No fluff, no filler. Just candid insights from seasoned product leaders.
Our guests deliver actionable, real-world answers. Whether you're an experienced product leader or just stepping into the product world, this is your go-to podcast for sharp, tested advice, condensed for your busy schedule.
One tough challenge, practical insights, short and real.
Let's dive in.
Okay, hey everyone, we're back with another episode of Product Academy Tough Stuff, and today we're going to talk about pricing. Yeah, few product decisions are as consequential as pricing. If you get it right, you can accelerate your growth and signal the right value, and if you get it wrong, you leave money on the table, confuse the market, or price yourself out of the customers that you actually want. So that's why I'm so glad I get to talk to you today, Iulia. Iulia Jacobsson is here today. She's a product advisor, a coach, former VP of product at Beekeeper and former head of product at FIFA, and someone who has lived through a full pricing and packaging overhaul from the inside. Iulia, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Tanya. It's great to be here with you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. So the first question for you is, why is pricing so damn hard? What makes it so hard?
For me, it's the fact that it brings just about everything together. You have both the very quantitative, analytical, price modeling, financial analysis component of it, which is key, and you need to run the numbers, basically. But it also incorporates a lot of psychological factors as well, whether that's from inside the organization that's building and selling the product, or from external, the market, your potential customers, your actual customers. And you have to take everything into account. You're not doing pricing in isolation. You also have to make sure you look at your competition and you look at your customer segments and what they're willing to pay for it. And sometimes what they tell you they're willing to pay for it may not actually match up with what they do when you put a price in front of them. So all of these components and the fact that it basically can run the gamut from sales and marketing to finance and accounting and of course product, which is my area. Everyone comes to the table with very different perspectives, and putting everything together into a coherent package that you can stand behind as an entire company can be quite a bit of work depending on where you are in the journey.
Yeah, absolutely. So given that there are so many different parties at the table, you just described it, do you think there's someone or a role in the company who should own the pricing process?
I think it really depends. The most important thing is that it's clear who owns it and what process is used in order to update it or just maintain it. Sometimes you might not have big changes for a while. It can be sales, but then you have to make sure you're aware of the incentives that sales runs on. It can be product. Depending on the organization, it may not be the closest to the market. We all like to think we are, but there's a few layers sometimes in between us. And it can be someone in the CEO's office, for example, someone that plays a central function and they act primarily as a point of contact, let's say, and run the governance process where different decision makers come together and they go through the pros and cons and are able to come to an agreement. I don't love the word compromise in this context, but usually it's that discussion of different perspectives that helps, in my view, come to a better decision when done right.
Yeah, right. So I think we can already state at this point in the conversation that there is no one-size-fits-all approach to pricing, right?
Correct.
And that's why I'm extra curious to hear how it went down at Beekeeper, where you experienced this complete overhaul of the pricing strategy. So maybe you have to tell us a little bit about Beekeeper, and then I would be very curious to dive into your learnings from this strategy overhaul.
Sure, happy to. Just a bit of context before we dive into the mechanics of the pricing. I had joined Beekeeper in 2020, right before the pandemic started, it sent us all home, and it was primarily at that point very much a communication platform, communicating from the headquarters to people on the front line. what we ended up calling essential workers during the pandemic, but this was mostly everyone who doesn't sit behind a desk for most of their work, like you and I. And as I joined, there was already a shift to what we called more of a platform strategy. That meant that we were looking into all kinds of other areas, shift management, for example, document management, anything in between that would help orchestrate not just the communication going back and forth between people in the company, but also the entire operational process and the way work actually gets done within that organization. And we were starting to build all of this. And we didn't, in product, for example, we didn't pay a lot of attention to how it was priced at that time. We were very much focused in the discovery and validation and making sure we were building the right thing at the time. And sales was leading the process at the time, also led by one of the co-founders, and they had had a lot of experience in what it takes to actually get people to buy your product, and certainly plenty more than I did at that stage for sure. And as we were evolving, what we did in the first stage, and keep in mind that as with anything, your first versions aren't the most full and entirely polished versions. And we had experimented with basically add-ons or modules, right? So our customers would buy the communication platform, and on top of it, they could choose to buy an additional package, forms management, for example, or shifts. We ran with that for a while, but we were running into this tension between, we wanted people to use more of our product, of course, but there was this pricing barrier in between us and them getting to adopt it because it wasn't part of the way the product was priced and packaged at the time. So we were able to also coordinate with sales and say, okay, let's make sure that we handpick, if needed at the beginning, a few customers. We offer it for free for a period of time, just to make sure that we, have built the right thing, it's useful, we get the traction that we want, and put aside temporarily and for a subsegment of our customer base, the tension around pricing. That was great because we got to validate and people also got to see the value. Keep in mind that the product that they originally bought was meant to serve one job to be done, which was communicating with the frontline teams. And we were now offering them additional options that they may have not known they needed. We did because we did this entire discovery process and we understood that these organizations have more challenges that we could help address. But depending on who we spoke to, communication persona, for example, in the company, they might have not been as worried about shift planning and management within their company. So we also had to find the right people who are incurring the costs of not having this problem or this job solved for them. So it was an entire process to also get customers, existing ones and new ones, to see the value of what we were doing. And fast forward a little bit, we also had more experienced leadership joining the company in marketing and a chief revenue officer, for example. They had scaled companies before, and they also brought in a lot of expertise and more mature points of views. And as we were scaling, we also needed to do more standardization. This trial and error part that we did in the beginning was not something that was going to help us accelerate and move faster as an organization. So that's where this project came up, that it would be a good time to rehaul what we were doing entirely. There was in parallel or beginning right before this, another project that was looking at how we're going to position this differently, given our vision and how much we had already built that was speaking to that vision at that point. Marketing's job became also how do we position ourselves now in comparison, not just to what we did before, but also relative to the entire market landscape. Some of our competitors, the status quo, how do we deal with larger corporations that are already part of the landscape of a customer's software tools, like Microsoft Suites, for example. And as part of that, it became quite clear that we were moving from a communication platform with some add-ons that you could tack on top to a frontline platform that served all of the needs of all of the people in a frontline organization. And with that principle in mind, or that vision in mind, we took that also into the pricing project. We had very different perspectives, as you might imagine. But one thing that I think we did well in that exercise was start with some foundations of what is it that we were wanting to sell and to whom. And it became clear very quickly that our entire architecture of the new pricing needed to offer a slice of the entire platform to everyone, regardless of what plan they're into. And that also was a big driver from product, going back to what I said earlier, that we wanted to remove as many of the barriers from our customers to experience the value so that they're convinced themselves that the full-fledged version, for example, or the additional bells and whistles are worth it, and they're more open to upgrading and getting the right solution for them, of course.
Wow, that was very insightful. I have so many things that I want to double click on. One of them being, you said you offered them the product to experience the value at no additional cost at first. Is this the first, or was this the first thing that you did to attract their attention and to also figure out if this was something they wanted, and to also maybe figure out their willingness to pay? Or are there any steps before the step of offering the actual product that you already have built at that point? What else did you do before that to understand if it was worth adding this part to your product and what they were willing to pay for it?
Yeah, what happened behind the scenes was that as we were doing our normal discovery process, we kept running into these patterns of additional challenges, right? That's what started us on this entire pivot or expansion of our product strategy. And we ended up formalizing what we called a beta program. We recruited customers. So before we built anything, we recruited customers into the beta program. And we said, you can have it for free. Initially, we hadn't even put a timeline on it. We did when we matured the program a little bit more. But help us co-design. And I think that's very important, especially for B2B and sales driven. Help us co-design the product, and you get to use it and run with it in your company. Has limited seats because, of course, we can't talk to all of the customers at the same time. And the value for the customer themselves, besides the fact that they don't need to pay for anything, is that they get to shape exactly the solution they have. And I want to just make sure that this doesn't mean we're building what customer X or Y wants, but we are talking to a representative sample of our ICP and making sure that the solution takes into account everything that we've discovered, but is of course meant to optimize for the breadth of customers that we have. And that also put us in a strong position because we had the data points, we had the marketing stories that we could shape out of these very strong and positive relationship with our customers. And product marketing, for example, could run with these and shape them into great go-to-market materials. And peer-to-peer, word of mouth, right, is still a very strong factor in distribution, especially nowadays. And that helped us when people had doubts. For example, we had customers who were willing to get on the call with other customers or prospects to tell them about how they've used our product. So they became our champions. And some of them were really happy or impressed even with how much we took their input into the design process, especially some of the larger ones where they would rely on their IT teams and wait months for some relatively simple solutions.
That's super cool. So can you tell us a bit more about how many people did you work with in this beta program, and were those only existing customers, or did you deliberately take in also prospective customers or different new types of individual customer profiles that you hadn't served before?
Yeah, It depended. We wanted to have a minimum of 5 customers that we could talk to make sure that we cover a good enough range of examples. And frankly, it was easier for us to recruit existing customers that we had a good relationship with. But we did actually use it also in sales conversations with new prospects to tell them about it and offer them the chance to participate. I don't remember off the top of my head if someone took us up on that, but it was something that sales was happy to bring up in those conversations and definitely use examples from our work in the past.
Oh, that's super cool. And at what point did you start talking about pricing, about willingness to pay? Because of course, one thing is about talking about value, right? And additional value. Everybody loves to get more value from a product. But at what point did you start to put numbers to those additional features?
Yeah, we had to make sure we never had a very fixed process for that because some features were much more complex than others, and it took us a bit longer, for example, to extract value for the customers from. And what we wanted to make sure is that they run and actively use it for anywhere between 6 to 12 months, where we could get a solid enough case study from them. And with that case study, we could start quantifying even what the benefits of buying this additional module was. And of course, we looked at the relative pricing also to when we had the communication as a base and how much we thought people would be willing to pay for. Trial and error was still a valid approach to test. We had an initial assumption about what customers would be willing to pay. But sales had, especially in the beginning, quite a lot of remit to negotiate and make sure that we use those data points from the early days of testing out willingness to pay to make the offering more robust and refine it. So one of the ways we tested that was to really just put it in front of customers and prospects and seeing how the conversation goes. In the beginning, you need any data point to be able to trigger it, and you need to have some tolerance as to how much you're willing to offer for free, or where your line is. As in any negotiation, you should have a red line. But I think what sales and customer success also did really well was look not just as the unit price that might have come from product, for example, but they looked at the entire relationship with that account. And then they would put it into perspective, and in that negotiation that could have generated another benefit for Beekeeper, for example, which would be signing a multi-year contract, right? So there are different ways of putting that into a win-win formula for everyone.
So you charged different prices for different customers, or was there like a standardized pricing?
We went in with a standardized pricing, but there was also what we call a volume discount, right? Which is typical in B2B, especially with mid and larger size customers. And depending, and this is back in when seats was the unit of sale as the primary thing, you would have a sliding factor based on the volume they would purchase. But that was also something that was quite predefined. So there was a sales calculator at some point to make sure that everything was relatively easy and straightforward for our internal team and for the prospect or the customer to get transparency into how they were being charged.
And that brings us to a very complex and new topic, which is how has pricing been influenced by AI, and how have the units of measurement changed also when it comes to pricing now that AI is so dominant in our product management field?
Yeah, I think this will shock no one at this point. If they're listening to us online, they cannot hide from the fact that AI runs on credits. And I think what's fascinating is that we're seeing the disruption in both dimensions, one being the business model itself, and the second one being the technology. And everything that might have taken years before to build and bring to market can be vibe code. in a few weeks. And so customers or prospects are questioning, do I really need that? Or do I need to buy my internal IT some more cloud credits and let them run wild and set it up for exactly what we need and not what a vendor is willing or not to bend to make it happen for us. It's difficult, and I think nobody has the exact answer. I love the fact there are some operators out there, and Elena Verna is one of them, that talk openly about what they're learning. And just to say with a lovable example for a moment, right? They went through a certain credit model, but they listened to their customers and they realized people don't build websites every single day, twice a day. With old school SaaS, we talked about, wanting to make it a habit, like brushing your teeth. And if you could get a user to come to your platform twice a day, you got them hooked. You don't build 2 websites a day, most people at least, or at least myself. So they've had to go and evolve their own version of that, right? And the first principle of knowing and listening to your customers is still valid, but you have to think about what that means for your product. And I don't think being just a wrapper in terms of pricing purely is a mid to long-term strategy anymore, because you can see how quickly technology gets disrupted and replaced, and you cannot rely on just adding a margin on top of your of the credits you consume from the main providers to be able to sell your own product if it includes AI. I think it's quite fascinating. And looking at, if you're a company looking at your own pricing, I think, of course, you need to understand your own cost base, right? And experiment and learn with that with trusted customers. And at the same time, you need to be looking at your competitors and understand, what is it that you're selling again and to whom? And this was maybe a few weeks ago, but Linear came up and said, they started off as a AI native, but essentially an issue tracking software where the traditional pricing model was seed-based, and their own data showed that it's not individual users using their product anymore, but agents were making up a more and more significant part of their consumption. So what is the seat when you have so many agents running around doing their thing? And you go back to consumption-based. I think many of the tech teams are quite familiar with the consumption charges, right? If you're running on any cloud, you will have an AWS or a Google Cloud bill that you have to pay at the end of the day. But the buyers themselves, for the longest time, they've ran with fixed yearly budgets that they got or didn't get approval for. And there was not a lot of flexibility that was built in their own internal models about how they would acquire different solutions from the market. So there's a whole learning curve, not for only the companies building their products and incorporating AI into it, but also the buyers themselves, and how can they still manage their budgets and not go completely over, but still go and acquire the tools and services that they need.
Yeah, right. And maybe one day we will get to the phase where we can actually start charging for the outcomes that people are looking for instead of just for the consumption, but that's still a long shot for now. I remember, I think it was last year that Canva suddenly tried to increase prices quite drastically, and then they suddenly decided again to revert to the old prices. While I was like about to cancel, they reverted. And I think sometimes they're just like experimenting, and they need to also be bold. The companies need to be bold and experiment, because what you described before is a quite extensive process. If you want to give people your product to try out for 6 or 12 months, and then only after you start charging them, that's quite a long timeline to start making money, while we're now everybody's white coding the next thing over the weekend, right? So now that we're accelerating so much in terms of building the solutions that we want to put out into the market, also the process of setting your new prices needs to change, I guess. Or what are your thoughts on that?
Absolutely. And I think the biggest mistake you can make is thinking it's done and set, right? The speed at which things change with AI, you have to constantly look at it and listen to your customer base. You've mentioned Canva, but Anthropic had a very similar moment just a few days ago, right? We're at the end of April now, when they tried to hide away Claude Code from the monthly pricing, and they immediately reverted back, calling it an experiment. And yes, you have to do that. And I think the important part is, and circling back to what we mentioned in the beginning, is who owns pricing. You probably want to have representatives from the different parts of the business in the room, but you need a clear mechanism to who can make decisions and under up to what limits, let's say, are they authorized to make this decision, or when does it become an existential topic for the company? Because I think that's also something that's quite fascinating. We talk about a lot of these large companies, Canva, Anthropic, even if some of them are not running on profits, they have the funding behind them that they're not going to go under tomorrow. But if you're talking about startups and companies still in the process of scaling, for them, runway is important, and they might worry less about how much margin or what the long-term solution can be priced at, but they might just need the cash flow to cover their expenses and stay liquid for the next 3 to 6 to 12 months. And I think that's an important aspect to consider, and it should be clear, and it can change, of course, from one moment to the other. But what is the relative importance of company level metrics? Do you need to be liquid for the next 3 months and be able to pay your staff? Or can you afford to take different risks or different approaches and wait 6 to 12 months if the market allows you to?
Yeah.
I don't think 6 to 12 months is a time horizon people can count on anymore in that sense. But you need to be able to have clarity as an executive team, as representative from each part of the business, what is more important for, the next 3 months.
Right, and whoever owns the pricing decision also needs to own the learning curve around pricing, right? And how do you learn in a structured way, which is something that product people have been good at in the past, I guess. And so that's definitely legit to think of putting this decision into the product realm. But whoever owns it needs to also own the learning, I guess, around pricing, and not treat it as a one-time exercise, right?
And I think it's the function, of course, plays a role, like you say, but it's really about the team you have. I think having low ego and being able to admit you failed. We still don't like that world too much, and we will dress it up as learnings, because hopefully we also learned along the way. But being able to own the fact that you failed includes the element of psychological safety within an organization. And we all want to have it, but that doesn't mean that we all live it in our respective environments. And it's easy to talk about the learnings and how to incorporate that. But I think depending on what scale you are, of course, looking at the personalities that are involved is also an element to consider when you hand over someone the reins. And I want to maybe make that distinction again. It's not about owning, all of the decision on pricing, but it's putting in motion the operating model for how you deal with price evolution, price changes, price transformation when you need to, and making sure you have the right people in the room to make those decisions.
Yeah. Absolutely, and that also involves balancing short versus long-term decisions, and kind of the pricing depth that you accumulate if you're going for the short-term wins, but maybe you start acquiring customers that are not your target customers, because getting rid of them can also be very painful afterwards.
Yes,
hey,
definitely hurts your revenue.
Yeah. Iulia, we touched on a lot of things, and there is so much more to talk about, but we've reached the end of the episode. Is there anything that you would like to leave our listeners with that we haven't talked about yet?
Oh, I can't believe time flew by quite so quickly. I think my last comment would be learn from everyone else, but make sure you apply your learnings for where you and your company are in your journey. You can't replicate someone else's model in a way that will optimize for your environment.
Yeah, that's very wise of you to say. Thank you so much for sharing your time with us and your experience. It was fun chatting about pricing with you, and I wish you a wonderful rest of the day.
Thank you, Tanya. I really love talking to you about pricing as well.
Thanks. Cool.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of Product Academy Tough Stuff.
We hope today's tough question gave you practical, actionable insights.
If you enjoyed the episode, do us a favor and leave a rating or review. It will help us grow the podcast and make future episodes even better.
Got a question for us? Send an email to toughstuff@productacademy.ch and ask away. We read any submission and might answer yours in a later episode.
Thank you again for listening. We'll see you next time with another tough challenge to tackle.
Until then, take care.